Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Matt Salem, and you've tuned in to another episode of Our Best Behavior, brought to you by Behaviorally. We are the global digital first leader in providing data intelligence through our AI and tech enabled product stack to help brands own the most valuable moment in marketing, the purchase transaction. We are Behaviorally, the transaction experts. Each episode, we share insights on trending topics within our industry and of interest to our customers. Today, we're joined by Anthony Tasgal, a leading authority in storytelling, behavioral economics, and strategic communication, known for his dynamic, witty, and motivational speaking style. With over 15 years of experience as an ad agency account planner, Taz has collaborated with a wide range of clients, leveraging deep insights to drive impactful results. His practical expertise spans work with globally recognized brands such as the BBC, Nokia, Panasonic, and the Royal Albert Hall. A practitioner, trainer, and thought leader, Taz has mastered the art of transitioning complex ideas into actionable strategies that resonate with diverse audiences. His 6 books, including the award winning The Storytelling Book, which has sold over 40,000 copies globally, and the newly released The Consumer Behavior Book, reflect his deep expertise. A sought after global speaker, Taz recently delivered a TEDx talk in Newcastle back in November of 2023 and continues to inspire lasting change through the power of narrative and behavioral insights. Taz, a man after my own heart, welcome. Hope you're well. Want to thank you again for joining us today. How's things?
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be here. I'm in not very sunny at all, England. It's grey, it's miserable, it's every stereotype of England that you can imagine.
Sounds
So
far.
I hope it's better where you are.
Not quite today, to be honest. It's quite similar, but sounds par for the course on your in your neck of the woods, at least. Um,
It is only for 364 days of the year, though. So that's,
well, hey, before we kind of dive into our discussion, obviously I had given you some of an introduction here, but I was wondering if there was a little bit more that you'd want to expound on, particularly as it ties to kind of, what led to your passion for storytelling, for behavioral economics, thinking about strategic communication. I mean, for me, storytelling is something near and dear to me. I love being able to communicate to our clients here at Behaviorally in a concise storytelling fashion. And to speak with you is great. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that passion came to be for you.
okay, if you like, I'll tell you my own story, or at least some of it.
Please.
As you said, I spent many years working in ad agencies as what's called an account planner, doing strategy, working with creative briefs, being a bridge between clients and creatives. And I found myself doing lots of presentations and enduring lots of other people's presentations. And also just helping to work on brand comms. And after a reasonably short period of time, I came to the conclusion that most of it was incredibly dull and incredibly similar. And I thought, how is this the case? And before I went into advertising, I was a classicist. I did Latin, Greek, and ancient history. And anyone who knows me knows that it's only a second or two before I start talking about Rome, Greece, or etymology. And spent a lot of time reading Homer, I mean, not the yellow one, and Virgil, and all those great authors and storytellers. And I thought stories are a great way of getting people involved, creating interesting ways of sharing information, telling us about who we are. So why aren't we using it in the world of communications and marketing and branding? So at some point, I managed to put all these things together. And then I heard about behavioral economics, which, as you say, is the subject of the last book, which tells us that human beings are much more influenced by our emotions than we like to admit. And I thought, what's the best vehicle for communicating emotions? It's stories. So all those things sort of got mashed up together. And I found myself training and talking and writing about those sorts of subjects. And, here we are years later.
That's great. I love it. And you brought up your recent book and your books, period, but your recent book, the Consumer Behavior Book, it's really something to help us understand how and why consumers behave the way they do, right? Which is, many times not what one would think, right? So I know for myself, I could speak to the fact that I am constantly, and, probably shouldn't talk about this too much publicly, on my phone while I'm driving, right? So like my brother jokes around that I do everything except drive when I'm driving a car. And, I'm putting on music that I want to hear. I'm dictating a text back to someone after reading what came in. I know that I should not be doing that, yet I do it anyway. And, I think that's an example that's analogous to consumer behavior, right? Consumers don't necessarily think through things and do what they're supposed to, for lack of a better term. Tell me about that dynamic. Why is that? Why am I texting and driving? Tell me, Taz.
Firstly, I just hope there's nobody from law enforcement listening, because if this was the UK, you'd be led off to a cell already. No, you're right. I mean, there's a great quote that I use in the book and I use in my talks for an American neuroscientist called David Eagleman, who's fantastically bright and annoyingly handsome. And he has this great quote. He says, "We don't think the way we think we think." And that's one of those lines that I just want to sit and like worship, because it's a beautiful piece of writing. Nothing complicated, nothing more than like one syllable long. Because we like to think that we are rational, logical, independent thinkers, that we all go into like Rodin mode and go, "Oh, let me contemplate." But we know, don't we? And you've been very honest about admitting it, but we all do it all the time. And a lot of the time we catch ourselves doing it. But more often than not, we don't even know that we're doing it, because our brain is running all these ideas unconsciously in what Kahneman calls System 1. And again, Daniel Kahneman, sadly recently departed, he said System 1 is the author, the secret author of our choices. So often the decisions we make and the choices we make are actually happening in our brain without us knowing, which is very interesting and enlightening if you work in consumer communications or decision making or behavior change. It's also slightly frightening, because what it says is that we actually have much less control over what we do than we like to think. So once you start thinking along those lines, all the things that we are doing in marketing and branding and comms suddenly look a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, more so, why am I a Mets fan? Why are you a Man U fan? I mean, this is another conundrum, right? I mean, rationally, I know I should, look at the Yankees and all their championships, being a native New Yorker, and say, hey, maybe I should be rooting for the Yankees. But no, my heart's 100% not there.
Again, that's interesting. As you say, I live in London, which is in Englandshire, but I support Manchester United, which is nowhere near
right.
London. Again, it's associations I have with my family who sort of live up there. So an awful lot of the things that we do, the associations that we have, and the values that we have, what's interesting again for me is often we don't know why we have them. Often we have opinions and beliefs, and we never sit down and think, well, actually, why do I think this? How has this become my team or my view about a particular issue? And often it's because something has happened unconsciously, and then we've just followed that path. And these paths are often called heuristics, shortcuts. So our brain will make a shortcut. So for example, again, when I was in New York at the Corporate Researchers Conference, everyone bought me a cup of Earl Grey tea. Right? Now, I don't drink coffee. It's a vile substance. I don't know how anyone can drink it. It's burnt mud. But I love Earl Grey tea. And the only reason I go to a particular, I think you have it in the States, Pret a Manger. I go to that particular outlet because 20 years ago, I went in there and I tried their Earl Grey tea and I liked it. Now, there are plenty of other places I can go to get Earl Grey, but I don't, because my brain is lazy, as all of our brains are. And the brain goes, you know what, it's easy to do what you did before. So a lot of the time, our brain is sort of almost acting against our interests. Because what it's doing is choosing the easy option rather than necessarily the best option. And again, that's really important when we're talking about comms and brands. Because clients are always telling consumers, we must do this, you must do this, because this is the best. And our brain is often saying, I don't care if it's the best. What I've been doing before is easier. So again, all of these things in the book and the training, they just upset some of the conventions that we've grown to live with in marketing and comms.
So then as researchers, how do we think about that from a data collection perspective? Because the data we're collecting may oftentimes be steeped in rational response. Now, I know behaviorally for us, we clearly focus on observation to drive a lot of the recommendations that we're making to clients. And to the points that you were making earlier, it's more System 1 in nature. But when we think about essentially the different approaches to understanding consumer behavior, the incorporation of psychological insights into research, what are you seeing as kind of the ways to combat that over rationalization or perhaps over reliance on rationalization that may occur?
Yeah, there's a whole section in the book And I've literally, it's the end of the day here in the UK, I've just been doing a whole day on behavioural economics with research people. So one of the things that I'm very big on is saying to anyone that is commissioning research, before you do anything, are you sure that you are not just talking to system two? And this is often as much for qual as it is for quant or any form of research. But if you are only talking to rational, post-rationalizing system two, your research is going to be, how can I put this, inadequate. I could say something stronger than that, but it's a family show. So what I'll say is, okay, how do you get to system one? Because unless you're looking at or observing or deriving insights and answers from system one, the research you're doing is going to be largely worthless. And depending on my audience, I will say, actually, I think 80% of research that is conducted is worthless for that reason, because it's talking to system two, which is only there really to try and post-rationalize and explain what system one is really doing. And there are some techniques, and you've mentioned sort of anthropology and ethnography. There's semiotics, which is understanding the meanings of brands. And there are techniques for looking at how system one works. So again, with my storytelling hat, when I do any research, especially if it's qualitative focus groups, I'll try and get people to tell stories, because that's what human beings like doing best. We like telling stories. And within those stories, I think, you're more likely to find a nugget of insight and truth, rather than just rationally interrogating people about their decisions or about their predicted behavior. Because again, one of the other things that behavioral economics tells us is that we are rubbish at predicting. If research is asking people, will you buy this product or will you, it's almost entirely useless, because we don't know what we're going to be doing in the future, especially if it's a particular context. You have to ask people what they will be like in that context, which is really hard for the brain to compute. So my first piece of advice, the general piece of advice, is just be aware of the limitations of your research if all you're doing is talking to system two. And then talk to some good people about how you can think about disciplines and approaches which bring system one into the equation.
I mean, system two is clearly part of the decision-making process, of course. So if we think about, where behaviorally specializes in helping our clients understand the impact of shopper merchandising, packaging, and overall just the path to purchase, do you agree that system two is part of that decision making to varying degrees dependent upon category? For example, buying food versus buying OTC products?
Yeah, my experience has been that it's not necessarily about product sectors or product types. And as you say, I think in any decision, there is system one and system two. And I think for me, the insight has always been, clients, please do not just talk to system two, or please do not just research system two. So what I would say is, in any decision, there is a component, as you say, it'll vary. One of the things that I've discovered, by the way, over the years is people often say to me, well, is it about big ticket versus small ticket? Is the brain more rational, more system two when it comes to an expensive product? And I've not found that. I've looked at people who buy like cars or homes, and often that's as irrational as buying, yogurt. So I don't think it works that way. But what I will say is, as I say, you're always looking for the balance of system one and system two. So again, David Ogilvy, the famous ad man, said that consumers need an excuse to justify their emotional decisions. And he used the word excuse, and I like that word. So for me, you're always looking at, okay, what are the decisions that people are making and how do they rationalize those? But what's the excuse? What's the emotional component? And that, if I'm emphasizing it more than system two, it's because for most clients, as I say, they're so system two oriented that I just need to sort of bring them back a little bit into the middle.
Makes sense. So want to shift gears slightly here and think about all of this in the context of the rapid uptake of AI in research. And, one thing I'm curious to get your perspective on is, with the introduction of AI into many a research technique, including, products that we have here at Behaviorally. How do you think that will impact our ability to better understand System 1? For example, is AI going to be able to code facial response with great accuracy? And I just bring that up as a mere example, but do you see any particular areas or ways where it's going to benefit us in terms of being able to measure System 1 and then ultimately story tell because of the results that we have?
I'll give you my own perspective, and obviously this is personal, so management shouldn't blame me for anything I say. My feeling about AI is I think AI is incredibly good at being efficient.
Mm.
So if you want to suddenly learn everything about a market or everything, AI is great. The push of a button. One of my friends did this the other day. He just put in one of my talks into, I think it was Google LM. And within like 5 minutes, it turned it into a podcast with two people interviewing each other about the content of my speech. And they are frighteningly realistic, even to the sort of like the little bit of the jokes and the banter. So I think it's very good at that efficiency. I worry a little bit about two things. One is I talk a lot about insight. So my previous book was called The Insight Book. And I think that our brain is still a ridiculously good pattern detecting mechanism. It's really good at seeing patterns and making connections, as does AI. But I think there are certain leaps and combinations that our brain can still do that I'm not sure AI will do. In the same way as I'm not sure AI is good at creating new stories or creating, for example, new jokes. I'm very interested in humor and insight, if we've got time to talk about that.
Sure.
And also with stories, my feeling is I've seen AI with stories, and what it tends to do is just recombine what's been done before. I'm still not convinced yet that AI is going to be the creative sort of genius and creative spark. So my feeling is get AI to do the dishes, the dirty work, and then let human brains really work, A, on finding the insights, and then B, equally on communicating the insights through story. So that, for me, is an ideal world. But it may be that by the time we finish this podcast, Matt, AI is going to be taking over everything anyway. So,
Well, no, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if I think about the way that I use AI in my own day to day, it's more so for starters and idea generation, not to have a
yes.
final product. And I think, in essence, that's part of what you're saying. I do hope that it helps to enable better speed and efficiency, to your points earlier too, with regard to data collection, particularly System 1 data collection.
Yeah.
There may be some benefit there. Storytelling, I hear what you're saying for sure. And the humor that's injected into storytelling, let's go there for a second. I mean, that makes being the receiver of the story much more pleasant, I would argue. I love humor involved in anything and everything. So, with that being said, tell me a bit about your thoughts on incorporating humor into storytelling and how that perhaps makes it more effective in terms of the story resonating with your listeners.
Some of your listeners, viewers may have noticed I am English. So if it sounds like I'm being ironic and sarcastic, by the way, that's just our default. But I've always been interested in humour, Monty Python, etc. So I've been obsessed with humour and I even write. So I do write and perform a little bit myself. And I've been interested in the overlap between humour and insight. Because for me, humour is analogous to insight. So insight is like something shocking and surprising that comes at the end. So two fish in a tank. One says to the other, "How do you drive this thing?" Just waiting
Love
for
it. Love it.
Okay. Why? Because an insight is like a punchline. So in any sort of narrative or data collection, you're going in one direction, then suddenly you go one way, and that's like the feeling of an insight. And there are, for me, two or three ways of looking at it. It's like a twist at the end of an M. Night Shyamalan film, where Sixth Sense, he was dead. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen. And again, humour, because they have the same response. Now, humour is interesting because it's absolutely central to our humanity, and yet no one really knows why it's there. No one knows the benefits of humour, but it does seem to be something that creates empathy. And again, for me, that's one of the missing links between storytelling and insight and behavioural economics. We're in the business of empathy, creating empathy. And again, that's what stories are great at doing. So for me, the more we can get insight that is unexpected, that is surprising, that is humorous, the more likely I think we're going to come up with things which genuinely change brands or change clients or change communication. And I wrote a lot about that in the book. So for me, again, that's one of the sort of what I call the golden thread from storytelling. It's one of the golden threads that runs through a lot of what I talk about, sort of humor, insight, empathy.
Well, then I think that leads nicely into, as we close up here, the future of storytelling. So, what do you see as the future of storytelling? Is it a man in a microphone doing stand-up? And I say that in jest, but I couldn't help myself in talking about humor and storytelling and being a fan of stand-up comedy. Tell me, what do you see as the future?
I'm not sure it's my future, actually. I've got a few gigs coming up. But according to my children, it's definitely not my future. I'm hopeful, and because one of the things when I wrote my first book, which is nearly 10 years old now, the storytelling book, I went to various publishing houses, and a couple of them said this to me. They said, "Well, we're not really sure there's a market for stories and storytelling." And I said, "I think you'll find that human beings have been storytelling for several thousand years now." And what's reassuring for me is the book's been around for 10 years and it's still selling. And yes, there are one or two bits that have dated, but actually the theory of storytelling and why I think it's relevant hasn't changed. So I think human beings are going to be going on telling stories, whatever the channel, whatever the medium. Nowadays it's Instagram and TikTok. There'll be new media, there'll be new channels, but we will still be telling stories. Short stories, long stories, binge watching, 8 or 10 hours on Netflix, or just watching a 30-second TV ad. Story's not going to go away. It will evolve, it will mutate. But I think as long as we're humans, we'll still need stories.
The irony of meeting with publishers and having them question that is, wow. I probably would have been like, have you ever heard of the Bible? I don't know what I would have said in that situation.
Yeah, you should try it. It's a good book. Yeah. It was utterly baffling to me. And I went back to those publishers and said, I've done my book and it sold 40,000 copies, so thank you. Not that I'm bitter at all. But...
Well, hey, Taz, thanks a lot for joining us today on the podcast here. Really appreciate it. Thanks to our listeners, as always, for tuning into Our Best Behavior, which is brought to you by Behaviorally. Taz, the time, your insight, it's much appreciated. For those in our audience, you can find Taz online on LinkedIn at Tasgal. I sorry if I mispronounced Tasgal. Tasgal.
It might be easier for people to understand, actually, if you say it, yeah.
When you're American, yes, it rolls off a little bit. And then all of his books are on Amazon. You can catch them there. You can catch them at any good online bookstore, frankly. Be sure to check out him and his books online. Be sure to check out other episodes of Our Best Behavior. The podcast series can be found on our website, www.behaviorally.com. And with that, Taz, appreciate you. And to our audience, we will catch you next time.
Thanks a lot, Matt. And even though you support the wrong UK football team.
At least I watch. At least I watch over here in the States, right?
Yeah.